So I'm a fish guy. Fish are in my DNA. In fact, if you look behind my ear, no, that's a bad Kevin Costner movie. I've been a fish guy my entire career. Tomorrow will be my 40th anniversary of my vocation, my first real paying job. My first job was in Sandy Hook, New Jersey. I show up on my first day of work. It snowed. Everybody had a snow day but me. I had no idea. So I'm a fish guy. It's my vocation. I've studied fish for 40 years. And it's also my avocation. In fact, most Saturday mornings, if you're looking for me, I'm 5 miles offshore. And it's kind of ironic because, you know, if I look back at my career, I've literally been responsible for the death of millions of fish. And yet, I'm out there chasing them one at a time. You know, what is it about that? And I've asked myself, you know, where did you get this affinity for fish? And it really goes back a long time, back when I was a kid. And when I was a kid, my father was in the Air Force. We traveled all over the place, and we lived in really garden spots of the United States, Wichita Falls, Texas, Salina, Kansas. And my memories for fish really go back to my time in Salina. And so we lived on the edge of a big wheat field, and in Kansas, the big water bodies are streams about 3 feet wide and maybe 2 feet deep. And I recall, you know, my brother and I sampling all the wildlife around these streams, the wheat fields, etc. And in the winter, you know, the little creeks would freeze top to bottom. So we'd go along the creeks, and we could see the fish frozen in the little stream. So we'd hack them out with an ice chipper and bring them home, right? So you put them in the bathtub, and the cool thing about fish is, once the ice thawed out, they'd start swimming again, you know. And so my mother really liked that, you know. And when we would bring home the rat snakes and all that kind of stuff in the wheat fields. Nevertheless, you know, fish has been in my DNA for a long period of time, and you know, I love it. I love the notion of, you know, these are produced in nature. The fish are, you know, wonderful, the most prolific set of vertebrates to ever live on land or in the water. So my first job, as I said, was in Sandy Hook, New Jersey after I got my graduate education. I worked there for a couple of years, and then I moved on to Woods Hole, Mass., where I was in charge of doing stock assessments for a lot of the major groundfish and scallop fisheries and other major fisheries in the Northeast. Really difficult management issues, you know, very controversial. So I moved up the food chain in fish counting, let's say. And then towards the end of my career, working for NOAA, and I worked there for 35 years, I spent the last 6 years as the chief scientist for the Fisheries Service in Washington, D.C. And there I was responsible not only for what's going on in New England, but basically the entire country. And so I used to say, you know, the sun rises in Orono, Maine, and my day ends when it goes down in Guam. Right, which basically means you're, you know, on call all the time. Everybody's got a problem. So I'm working in, you know, my job as chief scientist at fisheries, and I went to this conference in Japan. In fact, it was in the town of Sendai, which you may recognize as where the big tsunami was. In fact, it was 1 year after the Deepwater Horizon. So I'm laying in my hotel room. It's midnight. You know, I'm sleeping away, and the phone rings. Right, so I look over, and it's a 305 number. Which anybody know where 305 is? Yeah. Yes, you got it. So I said that can't be good. So I answered the phone, and it's Bonnie Ponwith, who many of you may have interacted today. And Bonnie was one of the center directors that had worked for me, and she says, you know, one of these oil rigs tipped over today or yesterday, and they think there might be a little bit of oil leaking out of it. So I said, well, you know, all right, well, you know, I tell you what, why don't we go out and collect some baseline samples before the oil, if it ever comes ashore, you know, comes there. So I'm at my conference, and I pack up my stuff, and I go home, and by the time I got back, the shit had hit the fan. I mean, totally. I mean, in terms of, you know, all the issues of how much oil is coming out of the hole, and why can't the government get it right, and BP's lying, and all these kinds of things. And so the administrator of NOAA, her name was Jane Luchenko, she'd been on the job for about a year, and she was one of the only scientists that in NOAA, I think, that she knew, you know, on a personal basis. So she asked me if I would step in and kind of be her personal science advisor on some of these things. Now remember, I'm the guy with the gill behind my ear. What do I know about oil spills, right? I can tell you we all got an education really, really soon. And so every morning during the 80 days of the oil spill, 89 days, we would have a briefing. And my job was to basically collect all the science that we had going on in the agency and try to brief the senior management and then also make some decisions about how to deploy resources. Now, during this time, Admiral Thad Allen was kind of running the show, and in any oil spill, the Coast Guard is kind of the quarterback. They're in charge. And Admiral Allen testified in Congress, and I always remember this phrase. He said, "We are dealing with an omnidirectional and indeterminate threat." And I thought that was just a beautiful summation of shit hitting the fan, and it was exactly right. Because, traditional oil spills are like a ship hitting a reef, right? So the oil comes up to the surface, you got problems on the coast, you don't really need to predict where it's gonna go, or, you might go down the sound or something like that. In this case, we had no idea how much oil was coming out of that hole. There was no instrumentation. We were getting bits and pieces of information. There were issues coming up like, for example, you're trying to shut that well off. So you got a relief well being dug right next to the well that sunk. And so you got all these vapors coming up, like Kendra described. And so we were interested in worker safety. And not only worker safety, but as this stuff came ashore, what about the general populace? And so there's questions about air quality. There's questions about water quality. There were questions about seafood safety. And that is, closing areas so that the tainted fish, my friends, wouldn't get to the marketplace. As it emerged, it was not only about predicting, when the oil was coming to the surface, where it would go, in terms of the winds, because that's very important for basically picking up the oil that you can, but also with this new issue that had never been described before of subsurface plumes going in different directions. Now we have a totally indeterminate threat because nobody knew what it was. And so we're trying to marshal resources to basically take care of this 3-ring circus, which happened to be like a 9-ring circus in terms of trying to get a handle on a freight train that was leaving town at a very fast pace. And of course, the public's interest in this was fueled by CNN and all the other news organizations who, their thing is they're trying to make an instant judgment about what's going on. And that's not the way oceanography happens. I mean, the tools we have are very methodical, and they don't lend themselves to all of this. So there were just an enormous number of issues. And as it developed, one of the big issues that came up was, the current system in the Gulf of Mexico, where it comes up from the Yucatan and it goes up to New Orleans and goes down through the Florida Straits, the so-called loop current. Would that take the oil from up around the rig up in Louisiana and bring it, number one, to the Florida coast, and number two, around the Florida coast and perhaps up into the Atlantic? And so we started doing surveys, and Kendra described one of the surveys that was funded by the process with the USF scientists. And it basically, in terms of making projections, it looked like the oil was heading not only into the U.S. zone but also the territorial zone of Cuba. And so we wanted to mount a cruise, with a research vessel into the Cuban exclusive economic zone. So the State Department asked the Swiss mission in, that's the way we were doing it back then, in Cuba, if the Americans could come and sample in their zone. And surprisingly, they shot right back and said, of course. Like, okay, they were worried about the oil spill. I guess they watched CNN in Havana or something like that. And so we got permission to do that. So we mounted this cruise out of Key West, and we go into the Cuban zone, and immediately there's a raft full of refugees trying to get to the United States. And so the rule of the sea is you got to pick them up, right? So the last thing we want the Cubans to think is we go down there just to pick up refugees, right? So now you talk about a dilemma, and this, right up to the White House. What are we going to do with these people? Right? So you have to pick them up. So we picked them up, or the people on the ship picked them up, brought them outside of the Cuban zone. Coast Guard cutter picks them up, right? We're swearing these people to, that they can have asylum as long as they don't tell the Cuban government that the U.S. picked them up. And so we offload the Cubans, go back to the Cuban easy. To this day, and in fact, if you put this podcast up, I still don't think the Cubans know that, but nevertheless. So that was an important milestone, an important issue. We basically showed that the oil had not got down to that level. So that was really important. The other kind of vignette I wanted to tell you about was the final days of closing that well down. Now, you can remember at least people that have at least some recognition of the events that played out. There was no playbook for trying to end that oil spill. The types of devices they were inventing, most of them didn't work because of the extreme pressure and the low temperatures. They would try to put a cap over the top, and what would happen was you'd have all these hydrates that would form in the deep ocean water of methane and clog up the pipe, right? So they'd never dealt with a thing like that before. So somebody got the bright idea and said, look, the blowout preventer doesn't work, but the oil is still coming out of the top of the blowout preventer. So why don't we put another one right on top of the old one? And then, one with actually had batteries that worked, and valves that shut off and all that kind of stuff. So that's what they did. So they put another blowout preventer on top of the other one. And so the idea was to basically turn the faucet off. Well, the problem with that is you've got this well flowing up, and if you screw it down too quickly, what's going to happen is the pressure is going to build in that long pipe casing that goes down 18,000 feet below the bottom of the ocean. And what if you got such high pressures that it burst out? That casing burst and all the oil was gushing out into the rocks. That would be basically the worst case scenario, because you could never get control of a well like that, because it would, the entire formation potentially could kind of drift out of the rocks. So how to do this, right? So everybody's extremely nervous about actually closing that well. Of course, there's a lot of pressure. Got to close the well. Got to close the well. So basically, what people wanted to do was close it down slowly and then see if there might be some indications of the burst out. Because if it was going to burst out, then you'd open up the valve and just let it flow, and then try to, if you recall, they're trying to collect that oil, right? So anyway, the screw was tightened down. The thing, it didn't have the appearance of burst out, but in order to make sure, what the Coast Guard wanted us to do was take one of our fish ships, which are equipped with these sort of really expensive fish finders, and then go back and forth across the wellhead and see if we could see a stream of gas bubbles coming up that might indicate that the well had actually burst, which would be totally insane. And so during that operation, we used one of the fish boats from New England, and it went back and forth, back and forth. And of course, we saw massive streams of bubbles, not coming from a burst well, but basically from all the pipelines that had broken in that area that they never knew about, right? So that was, there's a lot that goes on the Gulf that's underwater. Anyway, so the other issue there, of course, was you have this relief well ship trying to drill, trying to intersect the pipe that was there, with the idea of, you're basically shooting for a 21-inch pipe to drill a hole in it and then pump cement in there and close the well down. So they were drilling very close to that. And because it's a ship, it's not anchored to the bottom, they have to maintain their position very carefully. And they do that by using something called dynamic positioning. And dynamic positioning basically is there's motors at all four corners of this well, and they send sonar signals down to maintain their position exactly. Now, if they got a sonar signal from, say, a mile away, right, saying maybe the ship had drifted off, they want to make sure that they close that pipe down, because that's what happened with Deepwater Horizon in the first place. It got off station, the pipe got bent. And so what it's programmed to do is use something called a ram shear, which is basically a big pair of scissors, and cut that pipe, right? So the last thing we wanted to do was, if we had a sonar going back and forth, and in fact it was the same frequency as the dynamic positioning in the relief ship, that we would send an errant signal and they would shear off the pipe, right? And so we're right back where we started. Needless to say, that didn't happen. And I think you all know the rest of it. So in the ensuing 5 years, I retired from NOAA after that event. It was very traumatic, and whatever. And so I've gone to fish therapy the last 5 years here in St. Petersburg, and my career and my students and I have been studying the fish, and we're looking at health effects, and it's really kind of a wraparound as far as looking at the long term. I love the Gulf of Mexico. It's an interesting place. And more to the point, I have never had to chip any fish out of the ice.